You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
All right, today is Thursday, April 25th, 2019. My name is Peter Boettke. I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University's Mercatus Center, and I'm here with Professor Sandra Peart, the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership at the University of Richmond. Dean Peart is also the former president of History of Economics Society and the current president of the International Adam Smith Society. So thanks for coming on, Sandy.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So my first question actually is a big question, which is you have this track record of outstanding scholarship and also a track record of outstanding academic leadership. And how do you do it?
Let me just say it takes a lot of juggling. I have a good co-author who's very forgiving when I get behind on deadlines and so on. So that would be David Levy, your colleague. But it really takes putting aside things once in a while and then writing constantly in the evenings and on weekends. But, you know, we are so fortunate as professors that we can do that sort of work at any time and in any place, at least if you sort of got the ideas in your head or access to whatever you need, which is increasingly possible. So I do find that being a dean can be challenging. There are always meetings. Your calendar is not your own, and you just have to, work on deadlines that are less fluid than the academic life. But it's been a real joy because I've been able to hire great faculty and sort of rebuild a school that was in a place where a lot of retirements were going to happen, and that's been exciting. And a number of them have recently obtained tenure, and that was wonderful. And one of the greatest joys I've had is that my faculty, a year ago, the endowed chairs decided that they should recognize my continuing work in the scholarly realm, and they went to the provost and asked him to give me an endowed chair, and so that was cool. It was great, to have it come from your faculty. It was wonderful.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I wanted to, I understand. So one of the things that have always amazed me with you is how joyous the process of scholarship is and how joyous you've been in tackling administrative aspects. I don't mean necessarily at the at University of Richmond, but just in general. It never seems like a burden. It always seems like a mission of excitement. And I was just wanting to just push on this one last time about kind of advice to maybe some young people who are interested in pursuing a kind of a broader notion of economics like yourself, but yet at the same time have tried to find themselves in the niches in universities where they exist, and what advice you would give to a young person.
So I think it's important to be ready to build something, so if an opportunity comes along and you say, you think to yourself, I can imagine how to do that. Talk to people about doing it and, just start building it. So I got into administrative work by accident, basically, because the former president at my former university announced a gift, his first major gift, to do something in leadership. And the faculty sort of mumbled, what would you do in leadership? And I thought, I could do something with Adam Smith on leadership. So I talked to him and it opened a lot of doors. And I think you need to not paint yourself into a corner and do something that you just repeatedly do day after day, because it'll get stale. So be ready to see a new way to do something and then build it.
Yeah, the mentioning of Adam Smith makes me want to ask a question that I didn't write down, but I just was on a dissertation yesterday. One of the papers, in fact, was very much inspired by a student who had your co-author in class and wanted to work on that.
Great.
And as I was reading the dissertation, I was impressed twofold. One of them is how really fascinating this dissertation was, and how almost impossible it is to try to sell it to a traditional economics audience. But there's something about Adam Smith which is very refreshing for anyone who cares about PPE, for example. And I just was wondering if you might talk a little bit about what is it so special about an Adam Smith that makes us want to keep reading him today and learning from him.
Oh, wonderful question. So I'll just say I finished teaching a class that I call Competition, Cooperation, and Choice. And we start by, we read Mandeville, but we read a lot of Smith after that. And, these are students who've never read anything in the history of economics, maybe a little Plato or, whatever kind of philosophy texts. But they just loved Adam Smith. And every time I teach students who haven't been, chosen to take a history of economics course, I wonder, will it work this time?
Yeah.
And it does. It just constantly does. So you're right. So what is it that resonates? I mean, he's just brilliant. He's, anyone who reads Smith can find something that will resonate. Will find a story where they say, and students, let's face it, they're often undergraduates. They're looking for things that speak to their own lives, and they'll read a story in Smith and they'll say, yeah, that's right, and then they'll want to read some more, and so, I think you're absolutely right that he does resonate constantly, and it's because he's got all these insights. He tells it in such a, not in every chapter perhaps, but in just such an engaging way. He's an observer, the best.
Yeah, it's a beautifully written.
Yes.
And it tells you about the power of beautiful written
things.
Yes,
yeah, exactly.
Because we deal with a lot of people who we might think have very deep insights, but they make it difficult for the readers to to understand. I'm gonna come back to that in a second.
I can think of someone.
I think of the with Smith, it's just the beautiful prose. Right?
It's the beautiful prose and the insights.
Yeah.
So it's there are people who write beautifully and they're not saying very much, but
Right.
but yeah. So the brilliance of the people who are more dense and harder to sort of go along with, that you are going to come back to soon, but told in such a way that anyone can understand it.
Yeah. Yeah, let me not jump ahead too far on that. I wanted to, you're here today because we're going to be talking about Hayek and whatnot, but you also contributed the volume on Mill in the Hayek Collected Works, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that project and how you approached it, what you learned in the process of doing it. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so it was I say in the introduction that it was a labor of love. It took far longer than I thought it was going to take, but I enjoyed it so much. And I did start it just as I became a dean, or just before I became a dean. So there was a lot of putting it aside and then coming back to it as I was learning this new job of being a dean. And so then when I would come back to it, I would say, oh, this is wonderful. Now I'm going back to where I started, being an academic. And so it was just really great fun for that reason. It was a very complicated project. John Stuart Mill, all of 19th century sort of intellectual history packed into this book, and Hayek knew all of that, and that's why he packed it into the book. So one had to not only know Hayek reasonably well, but also the 19th century, and I hope that what comes through in that book is his erudition. I mean, he's just amazing, and we don't always think of Hayek as we do think of him as erudite, but not as an amazing historian of economics.
Right.
And so that's one thing that I learned that, it wasn't a surprise. I knew that I had read Hayek, but it was a surprise. I guess the surprise was just the volume of sources that he used. And that was the challenge then for me, because they weren't always known to me. It meant I had to track down a lot of, most of it was published, most of those things were published, now secondary sources and so on. And then there was the unpublished work as well. So the fortunate thing was that because of that book, the University of Toronto Collected Works emerged, and so much of Mill's work was actually in published form in the University of Toronto set of volumes. So that was great. And really that, like I say, that had a lot to do with Hayek collecting the letters that go into the Mill-Taylor volume.
Yeah.
So.
It's interesting about just as Hayek as a historian of thought, because I think also that there's a so when I taught at NYU, Israel Kirzner used to like tell a funny story that he was in charge of teaching the core micro course for the PhD students for when he first got hired,
Right.
and he did that for the first 5 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And he said that he woke up one day and he was designated as a historian of thought by his colleagues because
Yes.
the economics profession had transformed.
Right.
And
right.
so the way he used to teach theory, like if you go back and you read Weiner's syllabus from when he taught price theory to Milton Friedman,
right.
it's full of Marshall, it's full of Bombavrik, it's full of all these old thinkers.
Yes.
And that was the expectation. If you look at in the back of the Gould and Ferguson old price theory text, they have the Princeton prelims, and they're the prelims written by Mocklup, and they have
Right.
all the old questions about Bombavrik's horse market
Yes,
and all those
yeah,
things like
yeah,
that,
yeah.
which no one would ever ask today. And so one of the things that struck me when I was again at the LSE archives is letters or whatnot that by famous people that all referred to Hayek as a master of history of economic
Right,
thought.
right.
But like later on, we would not look back at it because he always told the history of economic thought for a purpose.
Right.
And now we have a different meaning of what that
Yes.
discipline is.
Mhm.
And so, I wonder whether or not even, many modern practitioners would view Schumpeter as like
Right.
a master historian of economic thought. But,
Right.
Hayek does present particular difficulties because also his citation pattern
Yes.
isn't always the most careful.
So that was a challenge. Yes,
Yeah.
just finding what book is he referring to?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
they have it all up in their head.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
It's part of their. I do think a great project can be written someday on what is considered common knowledge among the economics profession at various different times.
Oh, that'd be fabulous.
And I think it's hard to capture, but it actually would be a wonderful thing. Like, what do we consider all PhDs to know?
Right.
Kind
right.
of thing.
In any given decade.
Yeah,
or
because it
whatever.
changes.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and you can study that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mill also is a project that you've worked on separately from the
Right.
relationship to Hayek. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, and I've just recently returned to Mill, thinking about a project that I'm going to do in the summer, but and reread On Liberty, which is just one of the most wonderful works that anyone can read, and another one that resonates with students still. Yeah. So, John Stuart Mill is so important because he's kind of the turning point after which economics moves into gradually, at least, kind of racialized or a very different way of looking at economic actors. I think Mill is much more in line, well, obviously with Smith and also with someone who's important later in the 20th century, Knight. And really, what I've recently come to think about is his work on discussion and on speech is so much more important than I think today than perhaps people realize. And now I have in mind, what's going on in college campuses and the difficulties that we're facing in terms of trying to have people talk civilly to each other. And what I realized when I read Mill just a few months ago, read him again, is that his notion of speech is really sort of a trial and error process where people come to interact with each other and discover things, and it's much, as I say, in line with Knight, people talking as equals and exchanging, and so it's not just sort of speech out there in isolation, and the way people sometimes just kind of talk about speech like it's just a thing. It's a process. It's an interaction, and it's a form of discovery, and it's a deeper form of discovery than reading or learning, in a classroom setting. He says that in On Liberty, so it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and then what the rules are that allow that
Yeah,
to
yeah,
take
yeah,
place.
absolutely.
We have a program here called our Adam Smith Fellows, and we work with PhD students in the social sciences, humanities that are not at George Mason, and we run a series of colloquium, and they come and they read, like basically like our standard Socratic kind of seminars, things that that Liberty Fund or whatever does.
Mm-hmm.
And in the summer they come, so in their year they read the classics by Mises and Hayek, and then they read the classics by Buchanan and Tulloch, and then they read the classics by the Ostroms. And then in the summer they read Adam Smith and David Hume and John Stuart Mill and Tocqueville. And
Perfect.
Last summer we introduced these new readings from Mill, and I was blown away by how relevant they are for today, because we read his essays having to do with race, gender, and inequality.
Yes.
And what he speaks to today makes more sense in many ways than people that have been spending all that time since that time. And so he's another one who's a beautiful writer and full of insight, like Smith. So you've been fortunate in picking two people.
Well, he's a joy to read, and you're right to pick up on the equality and the gender issues. And I mean, The Subjection of Women is an amazing book.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
And it's
and he was so much better than William Stanley Jevons, on whom I wrote my dissertation with sort of in comparison to Mill. Jevons is all worried about women working in factories, how they're going to be talked into poor marriages and have too many kids, and and infant mortality rates were really high. But Mill doesn't see this as a problem. He says, look, if women can own property outside of marriage and enter the labor force, they'll decide to have fewer children. End of story. They'll make good choices in marriage. If they don't, they'll leave the marriage. It's not so difficult. He's really, really strong.
And that goes back to your point about natural equals.
Yes.
Because he trusts everyone to actually have their own volition.
Exactly.
They have those capabilities, right?
Right. So. And they're fallible. They'll make mistakes, but they're not going to make mistakes systematically. And if they do make mistakes, they're the best ones to correct them.
Yeah. It's awesome. So we've talked about Smith and Mill, beautiful writers that have deep insights, get us to discussion and dealing with natural equals. Now we turn to the 20th century and people trying to capture this. I should tell you that I just was, so David, your co-author, has been telling me for years about this flatland thing.
Yes.
And I just didn't understand completely what he was doing. And then separately, I have been very struck by how Jim Buchanan, my teacher and someone you've worked very closely with, both personally and on his works, how the burden that he puts on his reader to understand all the constituent parts that make up his argument, and therefore they might get misled on this. And so then all of a sudden I was reading one time, it's like, man, Buchanan makes this, and I was like, oh my God, that's David's point, about the flatland thing. They don't get that third dimension. They're completely missing it, so they distort the whole thing. And that is one of the issues that there's two questions I want to ask. One of them is about the, Knight, Buchanan, natural equals economics kind of thing. But then also what happened in the period of time from Mill to Knight that this became a flatland? Like, what had happened to our intellectual discourse that the kind of insights that someone like Mill has, or that, what you talk about even with Smith, with the Vanity of the Philosophers book, and what had happened in your mind that caused this issue?
That's a tough question. So, maybe it's specialization. But I don't, so I was taught in the tradition of general equilibrium economics, optimization problems, and so on. And I didn't realize what an important turn that was in economic theory. I also studied the history of economics, so I read my Smith and I read my Mill and so on, and then I did my theory classes, and I knew that the two were different. But I don't think I realized how they differed, or at least some of the significant ways that they differed. Of course, one's math and one's words, and so, there's a difference. But the important thing that I think David and I have kind of latched onto is this missing dimension, is that, when the questions were simplified into stripping out institutions and making a formal optimization problem, that really changed the nature of how the theorist was looking at economic interactions. So it meant that the theorist was someone outside the problem, writing down the problem, solving the problem, and then positing rational economic actors who get to equilibrium. And then if they don't get to equilibrium, suggesting that there's some mistake, right, some irrationality that needs to be fixed. And so that, I do think that we've all known that happened, but I don't think we've yet fully appreciated what it means. And that's why I think your book is important, that we'll talk about this afternoon. I mean, just this, and Buchanan was trying to get people to think about how you could look at the economic problem as people interacting, trying to discover the best ways to live together. But that project was sidelined.
Yeah, just to jump ahead a little bit, I hope that this doesn't send us wrong, but one of the things that I was struck in your most recent book with David on the Virginia School is the letter between Buchanan and Olson on basically fixed preferences.
Yes.
Because it's such a fascinating distinction, because Buchanan's point is such a very subtle point, that he's not doing the Stigler-Becker move.
Right.
But yet he's also not doing preference-based economics, and trying to communicate that to Olson. And whether or not Olson can see that is up for grabs, because we don't have the second letter back, right? But it's an interesting thing that Buchanan's doing. And I just reread, and actually this is a kind of a strange exercise, but because of reading your book, I went back and I read Knight's presidential address to the American Economic Association, and I was so struck by it that I then went and read it to my class on Tuesday night, which I'm sure they must have thought, like, what the hell is this guy doing? And I was, I didn't do voices or anything. I just, sort of tried to pick out the highlights of the thing about that. But what he's saying to them, I'm just trying to envision, in this audience is a people who have already flattened economics.
Right.
Because remember, he doesn't become president. He doesn't allow himself to be voted president earlier because he turns it down because he doesn't want to do administration.
Right,
so he's at the back end of his career.
Yeah.
So it's 1950. This means Samuelsonian economics has already got a grab.
Right.
You already have this beginning of the striving to have an institutionalist economics.
Yes. Yep.
And here comes this guy along, and he's talking about democracy and whether or not, this is like a democratic way of analyzing it. And yet at the same time, he's admitting that the people that are inside the democracy can sometimes reject, and therefore maybe our whole enterprise is worthless.
Right. Yeah.
It's so Buchanan-esque in terms of this weird mix of pessimism and these deep insights, and I just wonder what they would have thought.
Yes. So I think there was a weird mix of pessimism and insights, and I don't know if you ever feel that way, but I sometimes feel it myself. I mean, I think you're a pretty positive person, and most of the time I am too, but I mean, just in terms of trying to trying to have people understand what it is we're trying to do. One of the things about the Virginia School book is we're trying to give enough of the evidence, the letters and the documents and so on, so that people can form their own conclusions, but also, be dispassionate about it, about the situation, so that we're not seen as kind of ideologically presenting this case, and the whole case about ideology. They've been identified with having a certain ideological bent, and what we're trying to say in the book, or show in the book, is that there's a methodological point, and that's what deeply characterized them, and it's the flatland point. And if you read those letters, these are letters that they didn't expect to be published, right? These are their own thoughts about what they were on about, and I mean, they're wonderful for one thing, just to sort of see the story unfold. But even the very early ones, so the one you're talking about is a little bit later, but in 59 and 60, and so when Nutter writes to Coase and he says, if we tried to do what everyone else is doing, we'd just be third rate. But actually, that's not relevant. We don't want to do that. We want to do a different kind of economics. And then Buchanan trying to explain to the Ford Foundation what they were on about, and the Ford Foundation didn't get it.
Right.
You can tell. And there are people who are never going to get that story, I think. But to the extent that people read the letters, I think they'll come to understand better what they were on about.
Yeah, I think that. So I mean, I want to get to the long line of work that you've been doing on natural equals, because this is, I think,
huge.
extremely important part of what actually goes in that. But before that, so it is intriguing because in Dick Wagner's presentation of Buchanan's project, which is in some sense caught up in the spirit of the TJC and what they were trying to do in terms of the liberal political economy project. But by that liberal political economy project, they don't mean what people read as like some version of libertarianism or something.
Right.
There's really there is a normative bent, obviously, but that's not the point. The point is this methodological idea about how it is that you structure the democratic discourse.
Right.
So the Ostroms in their work, they actually go as far, because they're very much influenced, I think, by the same tradition, to be honest.
Yeah.
And Vincent says at one point, he says, the point is to have a social science that's worthy, right, of serving a self-governing democratic society.
Oh, interesting.
So like, who would ever think of that as a social, like that's not something that other people think about, that you have a social science that's constrained by this project of self-governing democratic society.
Right.
But if you believe that you're having a political economy that has to fit into a world of equals, that we're one another's equals, and that's what we're trying to do. And so that brings in a whole new light about Buchanan's point about, from the 49 paper, about that you can't do public finance unless you postulate a theory of the state.
Right.
And again, it's not normative in the same way that other people's might have had the project of, but it's definitely normative in some way, but it's not ideological. Let me put it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And he writes, there's one letter in which he writes that Knight's project presumed a moral development in which people had the ability to imagine themselves as someone else, and I think that's really important, because that's part of the whole natural equals thing.
Right.
We all have that facility, and to my point about pessimism, optimism, sometimes I wonder if today we've in significant ways we've kind of lost that ability, but that may take you too far aside, but it does make me think.
Well, as a university leader, you have to worry about those kind of questions.
No kidding.
And especially what we're doing with young people's, in terms of creating the environment for them to actually be able to engage in that kind of discourse.
Right. And it's a very Smithian point.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that he attributes it to Knight, because I think of Knight more kind of in line with Mill, but I think it's Mill, Smith, and Knight, and Buchanan all on this natural equals business.
So let me get to that then,
sure.
and let's talk about that, because it's been an impressive array of works, because you have the Vanity of the Philosophers Project, you have the Escape from Democracy Project, and now you have the Virginia School Project. So it's been a sustained series of work on this political economy of natural equals. And so for the listeners out there, just if you could explain what natural equals are, what these kind of questions raise, and maybe, well, let's just start with there, and then I'll ask you the question about Buchanan's criticism of his people that he's fighting.
So I'll start with the Smithian point, where Smith argues that we're essentially the same when we come into the world, and then it's what what we call incentives, luck, and history, that the division of labor, which causes us to be different as we go into the labor market and so on. So the point is, we're basically equally capable of making choices, of speech, of reason, of imaginative thinking, and we do end up being different. And as David and I have developed this, we call it analytical egalitarianism. So for the purposes of analyzing economic choices, political choices, we need to presume that people are roughly equivalent. Obviously, we're a little bit different physically, but those things don't particularly matter in the political or economic realm, putting aside whether you are equipped to play, basketball or something,
Right.
which I'm, as a 5'1" person, not equipped to do. So that's the basic point. And in the 19th century, economists through John Stuart Mill, I would argue, accept that point and fall in that tradition, and then it's attacked. The position is attacked late in the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, by a number of biologists, anthropologists, sociologists, economists, political economists, who come to argue that different groups are different, and then put a sign on the difference. So some people are inferior, and in economics, this plays out late in the 19th and early in the 20th century in the case that people make for laboring classes being particularly myopic and not saving enough, and having high rates of time preference,
Right.
and so on, making stupid marriages, and so on. And then David and I have argued, kind of mid-20th century, analytical egalitarianism comes back into economic theory thinking, in part thanks to Buchanan, but also the Austrian school, and Lionel Robbins at the LSE. So there's a reason, you go to the LSE, because there are intellectual connections. And I think the key connection is around analytical egalitarianism, a way of looking at economic actors.
Yeah, it's interesting related to that. Again, it fits with your story, and your sustained work with David over these years has alerted people to seeing these clues, which otherwise,
Right.
because of the flatland, we wouldn't see.
Right.
So when I was doing some work on Robbins, who I've fallen in love with
Robbins
recently,
is wonderful.
if you read his work in the 1930s and you read the work that Mises is involved in and Hayek
Yes.
that are connected with him, they're all against the odious racial doctrines.
Yes.
And that's what they call them.
Right.
Like, we're going to fight the odious racial doctrines
Right.
because they see it left and right, by the way. They
Right,
see it
right.
across the spectrum,
Yes.
that we have to fight this. And then all of a sudden it makes sense that they would be on the opposite side of the eugenicists and
Exactly.
all this. But one of the things that's fascinating in the conversation, again, I don't want to run too quickly ahead, but is that you and David are flipping the argument in many ways on a lot of the critics
Yes.
of the argument from a Buchanan or someone like that, because you're arguing this is democracy. Like, these are the defenders of democracy,
Right.
as opposed to the non-defenders.
Exactly.
So the natural hierarchies, the natural elites. And so it's in the most recent book, one of the things that's very important, I think, for you to lay out is that there was also this anti-democratic
Yes.
movement that's associated in the same space as Buchanan and whatnot, but
Right.
they're not. They're like far apart.
They're
Yeah.
terrible. They're nasty. And that's another flatland problem, because they're sometimes seen as equivalent to the analytical egalitarians. And to your point about flipping things around, abstract economic people have been, that notion has been criticized, and it certainly isn't, it's not a realistic sort of way to describe economic actors. But if by adding in things, by adding realism, you add in attributes that mean that, poor people are not good at making choices,
Right.
then you as the theorist are just kind of imposing some sort of, view that isn't warranted. So I used to like a lot of graduate students think abstract economic, man, what's that? But now I appreciate why it's so important, because it removes everything that's important and says, it removes everything that's sort of extraneous to being able to choose, and it says, okay, once you do that, we're equal.
Yeah, I don't know how successful this distinction is, but I think that when we have very thin notions of rationality, what that requires for our explanations to go through is much thicker notions
Yes.
of institutions,
Sure.
which is the emphasis on rules.
Mm-hmm.
And when we have imbue the rationality hypothesis and everything with such really thick notions, fill out the utility function
Right,
and
right,
give
right.
great cognitive capacities, we end up by having very thin notions of institutions.
Yes.
And what happened in that period that we were talking about is that because of mathematical tractability, we started to put more and more things into the cognitive capacities of the choosers, therefore eliminating the institutions, and then point it to the failure of the world to conform to that very thick notion of rationality.
That's
And then said,
exactly
see,
right.
now we don't have anything, so
Right.
we need to step in.
Right.
And so I'm actually I'm writing a piece right now on Alchin and why
sure.
it is that Alchin wrote the uncertainty evolution, paper, because he actually wants to say that the institutions do the weeding out. So the institutions are what's smart.
Oh, interesting.
Rather
Yeah,
than the individuals being
Yeah.
that smart.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, I don't know if it will work, but that's like what I'm thinking about trying to do. And I was alerted again to the sort of ideas, even going back to how the dismal science got its name, and the
Right.
idea of the analytical egalitarianism as being the anti-identity aspects of that.
Right.
And
right.
how important that is for our understanding of the way we interact with one another.
Right. Right. And since you mentioned the expert book, I'll just say, that in that book, we take that insight and really try to apply it to policy advisors, to experts, where I
Yeah.
think, Buchanan was wonderful in that he expanded our thinking about analytical egalitarianism, but it hadn't, at least in my view, I don't think it's really, we've fully understood that, we who are writing down these models are also one of the modeled,
Yeah.
and we need to be careful about that and think about the implications of that.
Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do in the expert book.
Well, I think you guys do a brilliant juxtaposition in that sense of the evolution of the sort of marriage between Buchanan and Tullock
Yes.
in that regard. Because the way I like to think about Buchanan is his advice to us is that economists are not in any privileged position.
Yep.
That's the 59
Yep.
paper, right?
Sure.
None of us are in a privileged position
Exactly.
over anyone else.
Yeah.
We're all natural equals. So
Yep.
all we can do is offer our advice
Yep.
as hypotheses to be
Yeah.
tested, right?
Yes.
And then he warns that we can't take the utilitarian,
Yeah.
the sort of engineer or the elitist mentality.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Yeah.
But then you come up, but he's a truth seeker, right?
Yes,
That's the
yeah,
economist is the truth
yeah,
seeker.
yeah.
And that's important in him in another sense, which is in the contrast between science and politics, because you can't have truth in politics because that's the route to tyranny.
Right, right,
But he has to
yeah.
have science. And then you have Tullock come along and he says, you know what?
Science is a racket.
Yes, that
Yeah.
we are in the model,
Right,
right?
right,
And
right,
so that's a kind of a fascinating thing. And the question then is that going back to the earlier one, I think what that does is then puts even more emphasis on that we have to have
Institutions.
rules about
Yeah.
truth seeking,
Exactly. Yeah, that's
which
exactly
you talk
right.
about as well
Mhm.
in the Escaping from Democracy book.
Yeah.
Because a large part of the engineering mentality is to move away from
Sure.
having any checks
Yep.
on the expert
Yeah.
to be able to do things.
Yeah.
All right, that's great. I would like to turn. I think again, like these projects that you're doing are fundamental for for the knowledge of the past, but also from where we go in the future.
Yeah.
And so, in the Virginia School of Political Economy book, you end with the idea: is it time? Is there a future for a
Right.
political economy of natural equals? And,
Right. Yeah. So great question. And when you said, well, Jim had these sort of two sides, thinking about the role of experts. You want to win if you're writing these things, and so yes, there's got to be a way to redevelop this. On the other hand, we're in this sort of situation where we're surrounded by other people who are putting ideas forward and so
Yeah.
on. So, you got to do your best, put your ideas out there, be optimistic that people will read things. Not everybody's going to read things with an open mind. And so you just, hope that you can convince people who do have an open mind or who are going to come to the text with a sort of, fresh new set of eyes. And it does seem to me that there's some sort of positive things that are going on. I mean, the political world seems pretty depressing, but the world of ideas, it does seem that the economic crisis the last decade has been kind of created a fertile ground for people to take a new look at things. What's going on in college campuses in terms of kind of disciplinary offerings and so on, I think opens up a lot of new possibilities for people who say are students from George Mason or whatever, or historians of economics. You can teach in lots of different places. You don't have to teach in an economics department, and so I think there are plenty of opportunities out there for people who want to create new programs and new research programs.
Yeah,
I don't know if
I was having dinner once with Pete Leeson and Andre Seifer, and Andre's comment to me was that none of the students that he has at Harvard would take a job at a school beyond a certain point because they go into the private sector.
Yeah.
And then he looked at me, he goes, I was looking over all the placements of your students. He says, seems like you've cornered the market on all the schools below that. And he says, that's pretty good. He goes, got to have economics teachers somewhere, and they ain't going to come from my students. I was like, yeah, as long as they don't, that's okay. But I do think that there's like Vlad Tarko is going to move this year from Dickinson, really high quality liberal arts college, out to the University of Arizona, where they're starting this new department of moral sciences. And I think there's the rise of these PPE programs and things like that. And so I think there's a lot of very exciting opportunities. It doesn't mean it's not difficult, to try to do it. Or is it easy to do research in philosophy, politics, and economics or history of economic thought?
It's hard.
Yeah.
You
especially to do it really well.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I wanted to turn to that because about methodology, discipline, and stuff. But and promotional efforts and your own career in doing that. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was there is a premium in the history of economic thought field for the last decade or more to be a historian more than an economic analysis. So it's history of economics rather than history of economic analysis. But, and that means a demand for archival research. And there's been a lot of people doing archival research. But one of the things that you and David do is you make your archives replicable, which almost no one else does, right?
Yes.
They make it, you have to take it on faith that what they're doing is that. And as we know, we have a huge replication crisis when we're dealing with supposedly cleaner data of statistical analysis, let alone now in the dirty data of archives and whatnot.
Right.
And so can you talk a little bit about the justification in your minds about why you did this hard work of making it so replicable?
So I think that goes to David being a statistician. It just sort of made sense. It seemed obvious on his part. And then on my part, I have spent a lot of time reading secondary sources that have done not a very good job treating the primary sources, and so it seems to me that the way you avoid that going forward is you make sure that, as you say, people can actually read the works that you're dealing with. It does, now that things are available online, the volume problem has become much less of an issue. But in our Virginia School book, in the paper copy, there will be a lot of documentation, a lot of documents, as I've mentioned. It means you have to pick and choose, so not everything is there.
Right.
So there's still sort of a replication problem, but I just think it's really important, especially if there are competing views of what someone's been trying to do
Yeah.
to make sure that people can actually read what the words were. Now you do risk in some archival work. I think you risk. I don't think this is true yet, at least for the Virginia School, but you risk the that you might just go too far into trivia and detail and so on. So you want to make sure you've got a good story and that you're not just throwing thousands of words at people. But
we know some books like
that. Yes, indeed. But like I said, I don't think there's just so much that hasn't really been done on the Virginia School. So there's still a lot of room for work there.
So I mentioned Robbins before,
yes.
And Sue Howson's book is a magisterial treatment. I don't want to, but she also has a point of view, and she has her own flatland problem because she actually doesn't see other things, and that one would see if they come at it differently. And also doing the counterfactuals are kind of fascinating there, because part of what happens after the war is a consequence of personal relationships that get torn asunder because of behavior. I will tell you that when I was at the LSE just recently, I was just there 2 months ago, and I was in the archives, and I came upon the divorce file, Hayek's divorce file, but in Robbins's papers, not in Hayek's.
Oh gosh!
And there's not a moment in that file where Hayek appears to be a good person. It's just he's terrible on all the different levels, and it's now another fact is that during the war, to escape the bombing, Hayek's wife and children lived with Robbins's wife and their kids in their country home.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
So they were like two peas in a pod. And anyone who's ever been married knows that if you have two friends and the spouses are two peas in a pod, and then one of them leaves, that life isn't going to be so good, right? And then, but what Hayek did that was worse was he dumped all of the negotiations. Remember, he goes to the United States, and that's a whole other story. But he dumps it all on Robbins to take care of it all, and then he's like a jerk about it, and then Robbins is like, so their friendship, like you can watch it, it's like going down the toilet during this letters, and I'm reading it, and I'm reading, I'm like, I'm supposed to be reading about Dickinson and like planning. Why am I reading this divorce files? But it was an amazing thing. But you think about like, okay, so when Robbins chooses to emphasize ideas later, it's not like he's going to be like re-emphasizing those things or interacting and doing all of that. And here's an interesting factoid. Robbins is who wrote the original statement of purpose for the Mont Pelerin Society.
Right. Yes,
and then he doesn't go to another meeting, right? And you ever wonder, like, why did that happen? And so it's a kind of fascinating thing. Yeah. And especially if you look for the clues in the autobiography, where he actually says he doesn't give up on the ideas that he was working in the 30s. Right. Like if you read the autobiography, he actually says he doesn't give up those ideas. Even the business cycle. He says in the business cycle, he doesn't say that it was logically wrong. He says it was inapplicable for that period. But it's logically sound.
Interesting.
And with Mises' socialism, he says it's the most important contribution, right? But he says the problem is Mises is a bad marketer for his own insight, kind of thing, which is a totally different argument than, I think Mises is wrong about this or something.
Yeah, you can learn a lot from reading correspondence.
It's amazing. And these personal relationships matter a lot. And I'm always struck by a line from your co-author who says that, when economists abandon their history, they leave it to the kindness of their enemies, to tell the story. And that's what's happened in the history of capitalism, the history of neoliberalism. And I hope people read carefully in your Virginia School book, because you actually identify a series of characters who do fit the description that the critics have, but they've been hitting the wrong target. They're going after the wrong people.
Yeah, and we look at the funding sources for those people, and they're quite different than the funding sources for the Virginia School economists. And we there was sort of a question whether we should include anything on them in the book, because they're not the Virginia School. But in the end, we decided it was really important to include them because we needed to show people who the Virginia School wasn't.
Yeah.
Right. And
who
those
who they
folks.
think they are.
Right.
And
exactly.
that's the problem.
And show that they both intellectually they're different, and because funding sources have been, mentioned by people who are not friendly to the Virginia school, look at the funding sources that they used. And
but I think even it's more fundamental at the time because the narrative that currently is going on is also the narrative in the back of Kermit Gordon's head, right? And so this is who he thinks.
Yes.
And it's kind of like earlier work that you did. So young Walter Lippmann is sitting in a class and he has Thomas Nixon Carver as his professor. And Thomas Nixon Carver, if you go back, is the leading representative of laissez-faire ideas in America at Harvard. And he's a eugenicist. And, so Lippmann sits there and sees. So when he hears anyone later on, Lippmann's more complicated, but at least for a period of time, when he hears anyone talking about laissez-faire ideas, he's like, oh, it's that guy.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the notion that because the Virginia school is for small government in many cases, not always, and Carver's for small government or laissez-faire.
They must be the same.
They have to be the same. Well, no, not at all. And these other people, Carver and so on, do unite around that laissez-faire. I mean, that's what they're on about. But the Virginia school is not. They don't say we're about laissez-faire. They say we're about looking at how individuals come together in society and settle on, or not settle on, but agree upon institutional arrangements that help them live their lives successfully.
Yeah, that last point that you just made, this is in Knight's presidential address to the AEAs. He says the idea of free association and freedom is basically it's a corollary of natural equals.
Right.
And so then you enter the collective action problem as one another's equals, not with anyone telling you how to do it, but he doesn't tell you what the outcome of that collective action is going to be.
Yeah.
In fact, he's kind of pessimistic about it.
That's nice.
So, all right. So we've covered the political economy and this methodology issue of the replication of the archives.
Right.
One of the things I wanted to ask you is because, again, over this period of your research, you've actually seen, and you've worked intimately with the Buchanan papers and whatnot. You've seen the evolution from when Betty and Joanne are running things to now the professionalization of the papers and whatnot. If you could just say something very brief about that evolution.
Sure. So I spent a year working in the Buchanan house, and not just in the papers, but enjoying being there with Betty and Joanne, I think it's really too bad that it took so long. And this isn't a criticism of anyone or any anything except to say that those papers were there. It was good that they were open, but people could have selective conversations with Joanne, and Joanne I think did have some of those conversations, and there just wasn't a way to make sure that they that they would be used in a professional manner, and that's too bad. Fast forward to now, it's great. It's just terrific.
As 190
linear
it's
fabulous.
Feet, and it's processed. I think one of the biggest issues, there's obviously, going back to the discussion of Tulloch, we are people in the model.
Yes.
And so, but we don't have to elaborate on that about stuff. But what I do think is a practical thing is that while Jim was alive, the Buchanan House was always viewed as a working office.
Yes, and that's
what I did. And in order to archive it,
yep.
you would have had to shut it down. So when we did finally do the archiving project, which of course took time for Jim's estate to be settled and everything like that, when January in 2014, that entire place was shut down for work.
Right.
And no one, it was because everything was closed off. It was like a hazmat, place. Yeah. And then the processing of the paper started taking place. And that didn't get done until, 2017. So that's 3 years.
Right.
Could you ever imagine Jim Buchanan not being able to work for, 3 years? It just wouldn't have made sense.
And it was a wonderful working office.
Yeah.
So as I say, I had a room there and it was just terrific. the odd thing is that it was also
An
a
archive.
place where a lot of things were collected.
It was more like a
Yeah.
memorabilia
Yeah.
place at
Yeah.
that time, I think. And the way I like to
Yes.
say it, because yourself worked there, Alain Marciano, Steve
Yes,
Medema,
sure.
Sonia Amade, a lot of different
Yeah.
people. But you found what it is that like someone knew how to find. So here's one of the interesting
Right.
things: is that Betty's papers were never actually accessed because they were in her office
Interesting.
until just when they started archiving. It was the last thing that they did, because then they just
Right.
opened up the office and they're like,
Yeah.
oh, what's this?
Oh my
and then
gosh.
and think about that. That's Betty Tillman.
Yes,
She's like
yes.
the go-between for the entire career.
Right,
So then
right.
that changes the dynamics, because you get like that flip side of correspondence and everything.
Mhm.
And so I agree with you that now is the time that people can really process it professionally and
Yep.
work at it like a real scholar
Right.
would need to work at it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a real treasure trove now. I will say there are a lot of archives that have similar problems.
Yes.
They're just cardboard boxes filled with. So I've worked at the Jevons archives, and there'll be just things, pages torn out of manuscripts because someone walked away with
Yeah.
whatever they thought was important.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm a little spoiled because I've mainly worked in Hoover and at the LSE,
yes.
and the Library of Congress,
Mhm.
and whatnot. But I do know, and it was kind of fun when it was the old Buchanan
Sure,
House, because
sure.
you could find serendipity. If I just
of
turn around
course.
this corner,
Yeah.
I'm going to find the whole
Yeah,
thing and
yeah.
stuff. But Jim was very funny, because I remember I came upon some stuff at VPI when they were, because they didn't have a PhD program when they first showed there. So he was
Oh,
going to have
right,
the
yeah.
chance to orchestrate it, right? So you
Create
have
it, yeah.
Getz, you got Tulloch,
Yeah.
you got him coming. They're trying to
Right.
make this argument.
Yeah.
And I was all excited, because I was like, because if you go and look at what the list is, the way they're doing it, it's kind of fascinating,
Yes.
right? And so I go there and I'm like talking to him. And of course, if you remember in those times, whenever you wanted to talk to Jim, then all of a sudden Joanne would say, let's tape it. Right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
you're sitting there. This is
The
not
little
like, we're,
camera.
yeah, the little camera. So she starts taping it. So it's somewhere in the archives. I have no idea. But I asked him, I said, this is amazing, like that you're doing this curriculum reform. And he goes, Pete, don't get too excited about it. He goes, I went there to retire. He goes, I was escaping to the mountains, to get away from the nonsense
Yeah.
at UCLA.
Yeah.
And I was like, but it was real romantic. And, this whole, no.
That's
And
funny.
so, yeah.
The other thing I'll add is that the whole memorabilia aspect of it was wonderful for grad students.
Yes.
So they could just go there and they just drink it in.
Yeah, and the
So it was-
photos
yeah,
and everything. Yeah, it was
yeah.
amazing. And the Volcker,
Yes.
posters
Yes,
and who
yeah,
they
yeah,
had in.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So I want to end up by asking you about the history of economic thought and your leadership role in it. What I mean by that is not only the Adam Smith Society, and then HES, which you play in that, but you also ran the Summer Institute for many years, which has become kind of a model that now some other people are trying to replicate
Right.
and whatnot.
Yeah.
And where do you see sort of these kind of the next generation of entrepreneurs
Yeah.
of leading the field of trying to get history of economic thought?
Great.
Not only a greater amount of people doing it, but also kind of creating the right kind of spaces for them to do that in.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do think there's been sort of a renaissance, and I don't know if I don't want to say that the Summer Institute contributed to it or created it, but maybe it did. But there are now, I think, a good number of kind of almost mid-career
Yeah.
people. So Stefan Koloff, for
Right.
instance, might be an example. Still fairly young, but having come through the Summer Institute, connected to the History of Economics Society, or the International Adam Smith Society, who are now established enough that they can both do their research and teaching and so on, but also think about how they're going to organize a conference or push things going forward. So that I'm pretty confident about the future, and I think this goes to what I said early on. There are more ways that you can do history of economics now than there were when I came out of grad school. Where I had to go to an economics department, as did you, and I had to do a regular PhD, which I think you should do a PhD in economics. I mean, I don't think you have to, but I think there's a space for people
Yeah.
who do that. And I think it's important that that people who do the history of economics are well enough trained to also do economics and understand more than understand some of the implications of moves in the history of economics in terms of economic theory and so on. But there are PPE programs, and that's a growing part of the academy, and those are places where historians of economics are welcome and can do really good work. And so I would say there's those kinds of programs, but there are a lot of other programs that are also interdisciplinary and so on. So even if there may not be all that many historians of economics or historians of economic thought in economics departments, pure and simple, sort of straightforward economics departments, there are many more places that they can locate, that historians can locate compared to 20 years ago. So I think that's good. The one thing is, you want to make sure you don't, so Mark Shabas wrote that article, Breaking Away, and I disagreed with that article at the time, and I think I still do, at least in the main. I mean, I understand the point it's making and so on, but I think it's important to not relocate somewhere and make yourself irrelevant then to the economics profession. So that's the challenge, I think, going forward. Not many economists are going to listen to us, but you want to get some of them too.
Yeah. Well, I hope that they listen to you a lot, because I
you.
think that you have done amazing work both in scholarship and in leadership. We're all the better for it, and I hope that you have very wide readership of the book on the Virginia School and the political economy of natural equals. Anyway, thank you very much for this conversation. So
it's been fun. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.